Hello and welcome to the Roundtable number 55. I'm Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live, and I'm joined by the estimable Mark Sleboda. Mark, how's it going? Thank you so much for being on.
Gonzalo, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the not
It's an
so round table.
honor. It's an
Not so
honor,
round table.
dude. You got to get a better class of company, man. If this is an honor, man, come on. It's a pleasure and a delight to have you on. By the way, see, what happened was that most of you don't know this, but I'll just say it anyway. What happened was that last Tuesday, I wanted to bring Mark and Pepe together because, I can't think of two guys who are just would be like sparks flying between the two of them. And unfortunately, because of scheduling conflicts, we couldn't make it with both Pepe and Mark at the same time. And so that's why I did Pepe on Tuesday. Go check it out. And Mark today. But Mark, you got to promise me that you will come back on when I have Pepe and you two lined up together. Because I think it would be a hell of a show. But this show is going to be great. And I want to talk to you about Mongolia, of all places. Victoria Nuland is going there and she wants to stir up trouble.
Yeah, I mean, everywhere Victoria Nuland goes, of course, she and her aides were just in Hungary not so long ago,
Mm-hmm.
as they're looking at setting the targets on Viktor Orban there. The government in Mongolia, although long, um, uh, very neutral, quiet, not uh, being too aligned with Russia or China, and still very business friendly to the United States, isn't playing ball. And Mongolia, of course, is geographically positioned to create problems for both Russia and China. Of course, the problem there is um, uh, any type of pressure exerted, or God forbid, another color revolution regime change attempt, would be suicidal for Mongolia, because they're a landlocked country surrounded by Russia and China and the rest of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think that ultimately the Mongolian political elite is smart enough to recognize that fact, whatever aspirations, it's the same thing as Ukraine wishing that it was an island off the coast of the United Kingdom or something like that. Geographical realities. But I don't think she's going to find that fertile ground in Mongolia. I really don't.
No, I completely agree with you. Yeah, because let's face facts. Mongolia is bordered by two countries, Russia and China, which right now are, it's closer than kissing cousins between them. And so, if there were a color revolution in Mongolia, I mean, realistically, the Chinese and the Russians would roll up Ulaanbaatar in about 5 minutes. I mean, what are we talking about here? And so, to me, it signifies this weird desperation on the part of the Washington warmongers. I mean, they sent the Wicked Witch of the West Wing. And to do what exactly in a country that, and on top of that, I mean, Mongolia is small fry geopolitically. Quite frankly, I mean, like, what do they have and how many people do they have and how big an army do they have? I
Yeah.
think it's inconsequential.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think it's more just poking. I think Victoria Nuland literally gets off on just, even if she's got no chance of success, right, in stirring anything up in Mongolia, just to be on the ground there and throw dual fingers at Russia and China, and they I think they rightly fear her presence wherever she is, even if in this particular location she's not finding fertile ground for her usual work. She just likes to show up to throw the finger and poke
Yeah.
for no other
Yeah.
reason. She
Yeah. Well,
really she comes from a West Ukrainian family,
yeah.
right?
From
Yeah,
Odessa. Yeah. Or
yeah.
around
So
Odessa.
yeah. So she is part of this Ukrainian weaponized immigrant diaspora in the US and Canada in particular. And it's kind of a dual-edged, these people are weaponized by the US government, but even more than that, these people have weaponized US foreign policy and the US government for their own interests, of which Ukraine is foremost, and opposing Russia in particular is foremost among them.
Yeah, even Blinken's family, I believe, comes from Lithuania, if I'm not mistaken. And so, there is a personal dimension that people don't seem to understand insofar as American foreign policy is concerned. Because the Kagan family, Victoria Nuland is married to, I always get them mixed up, Robert Kagan, I believe.
Yes.
And his family is also from Eastern Europe.
Yeah. He's the arch neocon in the United States. And it's very interesting, actually. If you take a look at the language that have come out of European Union officials, right? Whether we're talking Joseph Borrell, talking the garden and the jungle, the foreign minister of, the prime minister of Austria, foreign minister of Austria, and even, of course, our favorite European neocon, Annalena Baerbock, they regularly quote Robert Kagan chapter and verse, right? They openly talk about him and his books, right? You go down that whole narrative and framing of the garden and the jungle. That's the titles of his books, right? that you're looking at an EU foreign policy elite, right? Both within the European Union structures and within the state members, who have been ideologically colonized by American neocons. Gonzalo? I don't know if anyone can hear me, but I think we've got a little temporary problem. So if you can hear me, I'm sure we'll have it cleared up soon.
Oh, you dropped out too.
Yeah, I thought maybe that I needed to start the connection again. Sorry. For those in the chat, sorry, everyone in the chat. Yeah, I did not have the chat open. Now I do. I'm sorry. I didn't know you could hear me.
Okay. No, sorry about that. The internet sometimes conks out. There's literally nothing I can do about it. And it's a periodic thing. And if it happens again, just keep on talking.
Yeah, gotcha.
But anyway, we were talking about the Kagans. I don't know where we cut out, but we were talking about the
Yeah,
Kagans
I was
and Robert
talking
Kagan.
about how. Yeah, I was talking about how they regularly quote these EU foreign policy elite. Right, we're talking Joseph Borrell, the Austrian foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock. These are just some of them that I have seen personally. This language, the garden and the jungle and everything, these are titles of Robert Kagan's books. They quote him chapter and verse, and they even mention him and his ideas by name. So what we're dealing with now is an EU foreign policy elite, both the structures of the EU and the foreign policy elite of the EU member states that have been ideologically colonized by American neocons. This is not the Europe of Chirac and Schroeder anymore, right?
Yeah.
That stood with Putin against the Iraq War. This is a Europe now governed by an elite that are the European equivalent of American neocons. They have their own virulent supremacist ideology of exceptionalism. They are dedicated to the geopolitical mission of U.S.-led Western hegemony. They see themselves as natural extensions, even perhaps even more morally superior in a way to the United States, and help guiding that military muscle in the right way. This is why you now have a German elite that isn't at all bothered by the U.S. blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. This elite, they never wanted it built in the first place. They're perfectly fine with the U.S. destroying their own country's infrastructure that was built by previous German political elite, right? Schroeder. Merkel was kind of a transitional, where she wasn't entirely in favor of it, but she knew that German business wanted it. But this new EU foreign policy elite, they were happy to see it destroyed. That's why they're not exerting sovereignty. That's why they're not challenging or questioning the U.S. That's why Olaf Scholz just continues to bend over and take it up the rear from Joe Biden, and he simply asks for some more. The same thing with Macron, despite all the meaningless posturing he's been doing in the last week or two. He was screwed out of the Australian sub deal by the US and the UK. And then just in the last 10 days, they quietly signed on to that same deal to pick a few crumbs left off the table by the UK and the US, because France has no dignity, no sovereignty, no independence. They don't.
Well, it looks like
Macron
none
has
of them
never
have any dignity.
No,
they're all basically vassals to the United States at this point.
And they're happy to be vassals.
That's the thing.
They really are.
Between us girls, do you think it's basically that they figure that the Americans will throw them something personally in terms of sinecures, in terms of book deals, money? Or do you think that they are just ideologically on
Ideologically. European business is being hurt by all of this, of course.
Yeah.
These sanctions are crippling. European businesses are fleeing now the high energy prices in Germany and Europe to the United States. Biden put in this subsidization of industry in the U.S., of which European companies, Macron and Olaf, both went there to say, hey, could you not include European businesses in this because it's encouraging them? And Biden's like, tough.
It was, by the way, Chad, it was the Inflation Act that was passed that had it fomented European industries to go to the United States. Basically, it's stealing European industry for American jobs.
All of these energy intensive German industry, chemical industry, even toilet paper. Crazy. Yeah. Toilet paper is an incredibly water and energy intensive business. Water requires energy. It's just not profitable with energy prices now what they are. So they're all fleeing to the U.S., where energy prices still aren't cheap, but comparatively to the U.S., or sorry, to the EU, they are. The European leaders have just had to suck that up. They are gladly impoverishing their own states for the greater geopolitical mission of U.S.-led Western hegemony.
But how the hell does this kind of mind virus get into the European foreign policy establishment? Because it's a conundrum that I've been thinking. Because how is it possible that people who are Germans, they look at their own people, they have family members, extended family and what have you, friends that are telling them, that must be telling them, this is a catastrophe for us, and yet ideologically they just sailing on. What is it ideologically that the Americans are giving them?
It's elite circles, right? A lot of them go to top schools, right? In the US and the UK, they receive education. And then, there's a career path that involves NATO training, NATO think tanks and everything that they really, they fully buy into. I mean, not just, the exceptionalism. In more geopolitical terms, it's often called Atlanticism.
Yeah.
Right. The idea not only that Europe and the US are inseparable, but that the Europe and the US are morally and systemically superior to the rest of the world and should run the world, and the world would be better off if they were able to remake the rest of the world in their image. That they believe that wholeheartedly. It's not, I mean, oftentimes there is a personal career advantage, right? The sweetheart deals and revolving door they get after they get out of office, right? There's a little bit of personal financial economics advantage as well, right? You should never, think that doesn't exist, right? A dead end career path is opposing NATO in the EU, right? Yeah. If you take a political position of opposing NATO, opposing, U.S., military operations backed up by European members here and there around the world, that's it. Your career is over, right? You have no career path, right? That exists, but also there's a feedback loop where people actually buy into ideologically and believe this stuff.
Well, ultimately, if you think about it, this system where they go to British and American universities and they buy into Atlanticism, and they go into the right think tanks and then to NATO bureaucracy and EU bureaucracy and so forth, where they never really see the real world of their own countries. And so in that process, it's easy to weed out anybody who's sticking out. And ultimately, the people who advance in the system are the people who are most compliant with with what they're being told. Yeah, I mean,
it's systemic.
This is institutional. Yeah. I mean, that's the conclusion I've arrived at. I mean, I'm actually writing about this shit right now. Right. And
Ben Rhodes called it the blob, right? This you want to call it the deep state, right? That's another word you could use for it, right? But the EU and Canada have a blob that is at this point coterminous with the US blob, right? Yeah. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as a cosmopolitan leadership class. Cosmopolitan in the sense that they are transnational. They don't really see national borders.
Yeah, but transnational only in the sense of the West, because they certainly see the rest of the world, right? They don't see.
It's a jungle. America. It's a jungle. Didn't you hear, Borrell?
You have paradise and not the paradise, and you and I. And a lot of the others, Brian Berletic, even Scott Ritter, and them. There's a reason that all of these people who are opposing this, hegemonic world order is because we are expats, or me actually an immigrant. We have seen the rest of the world, right? Yeah. we have lived through and passed through the lies and the propaganda and the disinformation and the simple misunderstandings about what life in these other countries is like. And we have a crucial perspective that these people have never had.
Yeah.
And we lack that hubris.
Yeah, and also there's the obvious fact. These people lie, and they lie through their teeth, and they don't have a problem with it. You know,
and they believe their own lies quite often.
Well, I think that initially they realize it's a lie, but they repeat it often enough that they get to believe it. You know, kind of like an actor, you know, with his lines. After a while, he starts thinking that he's actually Napoleon. You know what I mean? But because the thing is, a while ago, a couple of weeks ago, I did a Twitter thread, basically, you know, breaking down how much money I would have earned if I towed the mainstream narrative from the beginning of this conflict. I'd be a very, very well-to-do gentleman. I will tell you that. I would be a gentleman of leisure. I'll tell you. You know, it would have been a lot of money because, you know, like all of these people are getting book deals, mid six-figure book deals, easy. If you are towing the right line. I can see it, for instance, with Douglas Murray, whom I despise because he's a liar. You know, he said in the New York Post, and you can still find it, when he went to Kherson, he claimed that the Russians had killed 80,000 civilians in Mariupol. It's right there in black and white in the New York Post. And you know, that's such an outrageous lie. It's just so absurd. But and obviously he's positioning himself to write a book about the conflict that will net him a pretty penny, and it'll be packed full of lies. And it's just really despicable. But I guess they're conscious. I mean, you know, they are easily bought, as they say. But it's just so frustrating when I get on this particular topic of the leadership class. Because, I mean, you know, for those of you who don't know, Mark graduated, you got your degree, I forget which degree actually, from the London School of Economics. I mean, he's a big brain. If he wanted to, Mark could be a part of the blob and make a shit ton of money.
All I'd have to say is denounce Putin and say everything that I've said for the last 13 years, I was made to say it, I was pressured to say it, you know, everything I've said on Russian media and Chinese media and Iranian media and Venezuelan media, I never meant any of it. And
I was just kidding.
Blah, blah. I could have, you know, I could not have to teach for my bread. Let's just put it that way, like I do. There's and for anyone wondering, there is no money in opposition to U.S. hegemony, whether you believe it or not. There is none.
No, because Putin's checks, I keep getting them, but they keep bouncing. You know, call it the Kremlin, those assholes. Anyway,
I'm waiting for the rubles for 13 years now, and I haven't gotten any from not from that anyway.
Well, the rumor is that if you talk to Shoigu, he'll straighten it out. But I don't know. I haven't been able to reach him. Kidding aside, of course. The kind of propaganda that has been pushed so relentlessly over the past 14 months inevitably gets to a point where it is literally impossible for any kind of negotiations to take place. And also the fact that Merkel, Hollande, and Poroshenko, they all admitted to the fact that Minsk II was entered into under false pretenses. They had no intention ever of implementing it. And so to bring
and
the conversation...
You can go before that, the January 21st agreement.
Yeah, and so I want to bring it to
agreement
this,
in Ukraine.
Yeah, to bring it to the current conflict. My thinking at this time is that the Russians are aiming for two things. Number one, have a strong defensive posture insofar as a possible NATO invasion. And number two, have the forces necessary to fully occupy Ukraine. Because they have forces in Belarus, in Western Russia, in Volgograd. They have another big chunk of forces in the south, quite apart from the actual men who are fighting the war. Would you agree that that is basically an occupation army?
No, by far short. By far, and that's what worries me.
Okay.
One of my big worries is that we have not seen another round of mobilization in Russia now for over 6 months. And that worries me because what that signals to me is that is not even after Russia forewent the big arrow winter offensive to play defensive, right? To let the Kiev regime throw itself against Russian defenses, but will, after that is over, and that's going to be big, and no one should underestimate, they will not win the war, but they could do significant damage, and beware of dirty tricks, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they have something planned that you and I are not expecting, right?
Yeah.
Mass drone swarms flooding the Dnieper, something, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is something planned for this. That they are gloating about. Hopefully, the Russian government, with intelligence that we don't have, knows about it, right?
Because you've been hearing that too, that they're gloating about like some Samson move, if you will.
Yeah.
But you've been hearing that too, right?
Yeah. Yes. So I honestly don't know what to believe, but I don't believe that they are just going to charge across open steppe into layered Russian defensive fortifications in Zaporozhye, and that's going to be it, right? I don't believe that. I don't believe these Pentagon leaks, quote unquote leaks. This almost universally Russian analysts, war bloggers, everyone thinks that this is convinced this is just some kind of elaborate disinformation psyop to lull Russia into false assumptions about the offensive and the preparedness and so forth. But Russia does not have an occupation army, right? An occupation army is going to have at least another 500,000 troops on top of what Russia has now.
But right now they have about 600,000.
Yeah, Ukraine is a big country. It's got 40 million people, and West Ukraine. Yeah, well, okay, so actually, it was actually only about 32 million because the census hasn't been taken, right, since 1990, whatever. And yes, they've lost more, but still, millions of people, big country, and West Ukraine hates Russia, right?
Yeah,
they hate Russia. It's the foremost part of their national identity conception. East Ukraine, of course, it's a very, very different story. Central Ukraine, they don't care. They don't have a strong identity conception. Yeah. They blow with the wind and their pocketbooks and whatnot. But West Ukraine, God forbid, Russia has to occupy West Ukraine. I don't see any other options, but when I see Russia not matching Kiev regime's increasingly desperate mobilizations, I start to get worried that the Russian government plans some type of diplomatic settlement with Kiev and the West in, say, a year, 9 months, whatever, that after this is exhausted, they hope that they can get something on paper. And I'm sorry, whatever they get on paper, it's not worth it to wipe your ass with, right? Yeah. It's completely, I don't understand how the Russian government can think that anything that they would promise would not simply be an opportunity to rearm Ukraine, drag it into NATO, even perhaps proper, whatever. It to me, this can only end with Russia's security concerned, and the only possibility of peace, at least in East Ukraine, right, is going all the way to the Polish border, right?
Yeah,
that
has to be
at least regime change in Kiev. Maybe not an occupation of West Ukraine. Maybe you can tell that it's if it's landlocked and whatever, to fuck off Banderistan, to fuck off to Europe if you want. But at least there has to be regime change in Kiev. Well, but that is militarily, that's 5 years from now.
I don't know, because things can change awfully fast. But here's my thinking insofar as Russian objectives are concerned. I think you would agree with me that no way will Russia sign any kind of ceasefire of whatever sort, whether they get to the Polish border or whether they halt now, without integrating Odessa.
I don't know that.
You don't know that?
I do not know that. the Kremlin, 9 years ago, I was saying that Minsk was crazy, right?
Yeah.
That Russia needed to intervene then. And we had Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 and one last attempt. I don't know that the Kremlin is as much of a hawk as I am. I really do not know.
Medvedev seems to be
Medvedev is playing a role now. We needed a new Zhirinovsky, and you know, the little purple whatever band that he loved from the UK, and Dancing to American Boy,
Deep
neoliberal.
Purple?
Deep Purple. Yeah, Deep
Right.
Purple. Right. I enjoy listening to Medvedev now as a character, but I don't believe that.
Okay.
I don't
fair
believe
enough.
that you have a 180-degree change like that. If it's true, I still don't trust him, and he doesn't really have any power now. I believe that he is playing a role, and I'm sorry, Putin has always been very moderate, very cautious, far too conscious sometimes of Russia's limited geopolitical horizons compared to the Soviet Union. He is a cautious, moderate, diplomatic leader compared to anyone else who could win an election in Russia.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's no question about that. And I always find it just so bizarre when they keep talking about him as if he were Putler, you know, and that he has imperial ambitions. And I'm like, do you even know what he's what this man is about? How
is there any world? Is there any state leader that is in any type of non-alignment with U.S. foreign policy that the U.S. doesn't caricature and demonize? Right?
Yeah.
Whether it's Saddam Hussein or the mullahs in Iran or Hugo Chavez, or that is their MO. That is what they do. They create a caricature image of states, and with the we can just get rid of this one person, and then they'll be just like us, right? Because deep down inside every Chinaman and every African,
there's an American inside of every Chinaman and every Russian
who just wants to get out. They believe that. They do. They convince themselves of it.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, like, my thinking at this time is that the Russians are, and I would disagree with your characterization of the winter operations of the Russians so far. That you said that it's been defensive. My thinking is that they have thought to themselves, why bother going aggressive when they are feeding us their army on a platter? And so just, stand pat and just keep on attriting this army that they're feeding us. And let's keep on trucking with this that works. So I mean that part I would disagree with what you said.
Okay, so here's the part, and I understand that logic, and I can agree with it if I knew what the Kremlin's end point is, and if I knew it was Kiev, but I don't know that.
Okay,
And
no, I personally think it is. I think it's regime change in Kiev.
Yeah, hopefully. I honestly swear that is the only thing that I would accept, right? With my family in Crimea and in Donbass and Kharkov and Odessa, right? My wife's family, that's the only thing that would make me feel that they are safe, right? With all this talk of de-Russifying Crimea and
I always find it so funny when they talk about Crimea that they're going to take it like that,
cleansing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and all of this crazy, straight up Holocaust genocidal shit that is coming out of Podolok's mouth, and he's Zelensky's advisor, and the Western media just nods along. There was an article in the New York Times this week. And on the face of it, it was about Ukrainian soldiers freezing their sperm, right? In case they die at the front. Okay, right? That's a personal thing. That's a family thing. She loves her husband, right? And that they want a family, and okay, that's fine, right? If she does it afterwards or doesn't, that's her choice. I don't have a problem with that. Americans have done that kind of stuff. I'm sure there are some Russians who are doing it, right? That doesn't bother me. But buried inside that story then was and a sign of Russian defiance and preserving Ukrainian
Oh yeah.
bloodline and racial purity. And I'm like,
Yes.
what kind of
What
what
the
is a
fuck is this?
Ukrainian bloodline? What?
Yeah. Shades of a certain gentleman, a certain Austrian painter. I mean, like,
Yeah,
what
no,
the
no, no. I mean,
fuck?
that is what the leader of the OUN, Dmitry Dontsov, right? That was his eugenics ideology. This fiction of this Aryan Ukrainian race, just kind of like subscripting of course Nazi Germany. That was their thing, and that is being repeated by the New York Times glowingly, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I was astonished by it because that's how far things have gone. They're talking racial purity and eugenics, which has absolutely nothing to do with the reality of Ukraine and Ukrainians and their ethnic makeup. My wife's family, right? She's from Crimea. She identifies as Russian. There's no question there. Others in her family, and she's got family in Crimea and some in Donbass and some in Kharkov and some in Odessa. Some of them identify as Ukrainian, but in an East Ukrainian identity conception that has nothing at all to do with the Ukrainian national identity conception of the Banderites, right? A
Mhm.
Ukraine that pretty much doesn't exist anymore because of the Maidan and everything that has happened since. But she's got her family has a Ukrainian surname, Nichitailo. It actually, kind of ironically, it actually means illiterate, pretty much. And she's as well read. I mean, she's I'm sure she speaks and reads English at a higher level than most American university graduates. I
Well,
know she does.
that's not pushing it nowadays. That's
She reads more American and British science fiction than I do.
well, okay. There. Now we're talking. Okay, and there's a
Yeah, all
compliment.
right. I mean,
Yeah.
she's extremely intelligent, educated. But anyway, where does that leave people like her? Her family's part Russian, part East Ukrainian. There's even an Uzbek in there somewhere. Where does that fit in with fanciful Aryan ridiculous ideas of Ukrainian bloodlines now and Ukrainian racial purity and getting rid of the Russianness in Crimea? That's genocide, right?
Yeah, that's what they're talking about.
You know all these fake stories about Ukrainian children being kidnapped and brainwashed in Russia, when in reality it's East Ukrainians moving their own children finally out of the line of fire where they have been shelled for the last 9 years, moving the orphanages to in their areas out. And you know what? They teach them the Ukrainian language alongside the Russian language. Russians don't act like that, right? We don't have that crazy ethnic nationalist poison, this toxicity that has overtaken Ukraine from its Banderite basis in West Ukraine.
Yeah, no,
If you
no.
listen to Prigozhin, right, and
Mhm.
interviews with Wagner's people and everything, they don't talk about Ukrainians the way that the Kiev regime military talks about Russians, right?
No.
They talk about them with respect. They
Yeah.
talk about them that how they have respect, how they're holding on, considering the support they have and the way the regime has fucked them and the resources that they have. And if they surrender, right? And they're not Nazis, right? And they don't have Banderite tattoos over their bodies, right? And what happens to those? I'm not going to talk about, right? But if they're the normal Ukrainians, and it is a fact that this mass forced conscription, right now devolving into desperate press ganging, has by far been focused by the Kiev regime on the people of East Ukraine, on the people of Odessa, right? 34% of those mobilized come from the Odessa region, 2% from Lvov. That is a long-term strategy. One, it's a strategy of ethnic cleansing to some degree, certainly. Two, it's a strategy that we might lose those areas, but we can continue drawing manpower then from the West Ukraine. That is, we will fight to the last Ukrainian, and we'll get rid of the ones that are the least politically reliable and the ones strategically we're more likely to lose first. That is a decades-long vision of this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's quite true. And also, there's a lot of videos circulating of Kiev regime forces at the front saying openly that they, as ethnic Russians, have been thrown into the meat grinder, and the other ethnicity is in the back. And some of them are very bitter about it, quite obviously.
Yeah. But they don't know how to get out of the situation that they're in.
This is what we're talking about insofar as this conflict, but people don't. I'm sorry, you broke up.
Yeah, they don't know how to get out of what they're in. They don't know how to get out. They're trapped on the front in the trenches with what amounts to Banderite political commissars and officers and blocking troops. They don't know how to surrender and live. They really don't. They do have very high information control. A lot of them really have no idea what's really going on. But they don't know enough. They're trapped in many ways. They don't know how to get out of it and live.
Yeah. And so
how many videos have we seen of Ukrainians who tried to surrender and were taken out and shot by their own side?
Yeah.
That happens
blocking
regularly.
units, for those of you who don't know, a blocking unit is a rear echelon unit whose job is to shoot anybody who abandons their post. And it's being used quite aggressively in this particular conflict. Yeah, I mean, the thing that just drives me nuts, for instance, is that, the Western commentators, I mean, and people who should know better, like this imbecile Ben Hodges, the American general or retired general, who's an imbecile, saying things like, by the end of the summer, Crimea will be retaken. By the way, for chat who doesn't know, Crimea is the size of the state of Massachusetts. It is a huge piece of territory. The notion
not only that, it's a peninsula, right? Geographically, it is impossible. One, it has an entirely pro-Russian population. I mean, 95, 96, 97%. It's crazy. You would literally have to ethnic cleanse it. But to attack a peninsula like that without a navy, without an air force, right? I don't care if you really had a 1 million man army and they were all driving Abrams, right? It would be militarily impossible. Right?
Yeah, it's just beyond the realms.
Right? I'm sorry. It's actually been admitted. The Biden administration, right? They regularly speak through their stenographers in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And it was less than 2 months ago, they wrote an article that said, the usual Biden administration officials tell us that they don't believe that Kiev can militarily retake Crimea. And Mark Milley has said as much openly himself, right? The U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But they believe that Russia has to believe it's under threat to improve Ukraine's position in future negotiations. That's the way they look at it.
It's stupid. It's because the Russians know the battlefield. They have the assets, satellites, human intelligence of all kinds. They know pretty much exactly what the hell is going on in all of Ukraine. And so it's only to feed the Western public opinion that the war is going well. You know, that's
the game is as much poker as it is chess.
I mean, I think that the thing that I find really shocking is that the amount of open deception that's going on in the Western media. Because I'd always had the notion that it was severely biased, and a lot of times reporters would fly in and get a very incomplete picture of things. But at this point, it's no longer incompetent reporters coming in and getting the wrong picture. Because when I was living in Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship, I would periodically read these Time magazine articles about the state of affairs in Chile. And it was nowhere like what they were saying in Time magazine back in the 80s,
know
right?
that. I know that from Russia, and so we have to assume that the U.S. media is like that with every country, and always has been. Right?
Yeah, but now there's a difference, because before they were misinformed and they were just stupid, whereas now they know that they are lying. They know it. I mean, like Nord Stream bombing, just to give my particular hobby horse on this issue of just blatant lies, and they hopped on board that stupid story of that pleasure yacht with half a dozen, Ukrainians, but not Ukrainians, different kinds of Ukrainians blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. What the fuck are you talking about? I mean, come on,
One of the things I would not underestimate, though, is the ideological ignorance of U.S. politicians, and the same thing with the Europeans. If you take a look at who their Russia experts are and what they are advising them, right? They get their advice from Victoria Nuland, right? They get their advice from Michael McFaul. Is it any wonder? I mean, these are the Russia experts that the U.S. has that are advising the political elite, right? So there's this feedback loop of propaganda and disinformation and ignorance. And who's to say at this point where it starts? And does Joe Biden really have any conception of what is the real situation is in Ukraine? I don't know that he does.
No,
I don't
he's
know.
Too worried about shitting his pants.
People in the CIA, they might know. Right. But U.S. politicians are victims of the whole expert media propaganda cycle as much as they're perpetuating it.
Let me ask you something else that has come up recently. OK, and there's been a lot of talk and rumor and this and that the Russians launched a massive Kinjal attack on a NATO military installation. I originally heard it was in Lviv, but it turns out it was closer. It was someplace outside of Kiev, and they hit it so hard that they killed several hundred NATO officers and just about the entire intelligence apparatus of the Kiev regime.
Deep underground stories. I'll tell you what. I've heard it. I heard it on Telegram already quite a while ago.
Yeah.
And then it was kind of echoed on fringe Greek media, and then it was kind of resuscitated again through the Russian media and through the it even penetrated. Even Newsweek did a piece to debunk it. I don't know. I have not gotten a confirmation or a dismissal of that by anyone with evidence that I trust. So I don't know. I would like to believe it. I certainly think it's possible. We know that there were hypersonic missile strikes, in both Lvov and the Kiev area at those times, right? And certainly, I think we all understand that NATO's level of direct involvement and puppeteering of the Kiev regime military, the SBU, is a lot more extensive than, well, let's say the Pentagon leaks even, have told us it is. But whether that particular story is true or not, I can't tell you. Right? I don't know myself.
Because a couple of days ago when I had Pepe on, he was like, yes, this happened. And he was getting it from sources in Brussels. and Escobar is not going to float something unless he's pretty damn sure. He's a cautious man in that regard. I also heard it from Gilbert Doctorow, who's also in Brussels. So I'm like of two minds of it. If it happened, and there was a concerted effort by the cosmopolitan leadership class to keep it on the down low and to not mention it, make sure that no Western media would mention it. That would make a lot of sense, because such a strike would be an easy way to trigger a massive escalation on the part of the West, and perhaps the military leadership in the West is like, no, we're not up for this. We're not up for a ground war with the Russians.
I mean, not now anyway. Not then. Not yeah. Not at that moment.
The way the war has evolved and showed up the weaknesses of the American military structure, I think that the Americans are realizing, artillery is king, and these missiles are it, and our fighters are vaunted F-35s that are, $1 trillion at the end of the day. Yeah. They are very expensive toys that will get eviscerated if they really go ahead.
In this war, in this place, in a land-centric war of attrition in Eurasia, right? Yeah. But if your war is
with China.
With China on the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea and the West Pacific, artillery is useless to you, right?
Yeah.
Artillery is just a bonus for counterinsurgency wars of hegemony across the Middle East. They haven't been preparing for this war, right?
No.
For decades, the U.S. military and the U.S. military-industrial complex have been geared up towards high-end boondoggles like the F-35, the Littoral Combat Ship, British aircraft carriers without planes to land on them, right? All this nonsense. The counterinsurgency, control of the greater Islamic world insanity plan. And in the last decade, the pivot for the Thucydides trapped naval conflict with China off of its own coast, right? They have not been preparing for this war. Meanwhile, Russia has been preparing for this type of war since 1946, right? I mean,
basically,
through the Soviet Union, right? They learned their lessons in World War II, right? They decided, right? Artillery, air defense, electronic warfare. That's where we're going, right? That is our military, right? And it's very, artillery is for conflict on the Eurasian landmass. The focus on air defense and electronic warfare is specifically to counter relative NATO superiority in power projection through aircraft, stealth fighters, bombers, cruise missiles, and then drones and the like. So you have a Russian military that is specifically designed to defend in the plains of Eurasia against NATO. And that's the way it has evolved for decades. The Russian military-industrial complex very quickly reshifted towards building artillery shells, rockets for multiple launch rocket systems in a way that the U.S., the Western military-industrial complex, specifically geared for profit, right, in private hands, just can't easily shift back into. And because they can't be guaranteed of long-term profits. They have to build new factories. They have to hire, hundreds of new personnel. They need new machinery to invest in, right? To ramp up production, to, sustain the Kiev proxy regime in this conflict. And they're just unprepared. First of all, they believe that their sanctions would crush Russia in 3 weeks. That's what you hear all this. Oh, Russia thought they would conquer Kiev in 3 weeks. Nonsense, right? The only one who ever said that was seriously, there were a few Russian commentators who are idiots who said that. There's idiots on both sides, right? But no one, is seriously in power said anything like that. The only ones who said things like that were Western generals, right?
But they did believe that in 3 weeks they'd
They
crash the
did
Russian
believe
economy.
that
Yeah.
the Russian economy, they would crash it. The ruble would be worthless. The Russian people would be protesting in the streets, and they thought that the Putin administration would be overthrown. They believed that,
Yeah.
and it shows they're not as smart, right? Even
Yeah.
about what they're supposedly in control of, the
Yeah.
global financial system, the global market economy, they make fundamental mistakes,
No,
right?
yeah.
That
Absolutely
in
huge.
the war of commodities versus capital, commodities won.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very elegant way to put it. Yeah, because insofar as the sanctions are concerned, they did not understand the size and scope of the Russian economy, and they didn't understand that. See, sanctions were very effective for piddly economies, small economies on the margins of the global conflict, of the global financial map, if you will. Because yeah, they applied it on Cuba, on Venezuela, on Iran, who are marginal players in the global economy, and so yeah, it was effective. But they went after an economy that produces too much that the rest of the world wants. And they've accelerated this de-dollarization process, which is a catastrophe.
They had a fatal conceit, a hubris belief in the power of their own finance and services and tourism heavy US and European economies. And they have always belittled commodity economies. Like, never mind that oil and gas extraction and production is one of the most technologically and industrially most advanced and difficult processes in the world, right? And I say that as someone who, you know, I consider myself, I guess, a green conservative, right? I don't have any of the postmodern liberal baggage, but I'm very focused on climate change and the environment and everything. But that has nothing to say of how difficult an industry, how advanced an industry of resource extraction is, and how important it is to the type of economy that the world depends on today, right? They had fundamental mistakes in their understanding of global markets and also of the rest of the world outside the West, which has just completely opted out of their existential economic war of sanctions and weaponization of the global financial system against Russia. And they are furious and frustrated. And the only sanctions they're talking about now are secondary sanctions, which is to say, sanctioning all the rest of the world that refuses to stop trading with Russia. That's where they're at now. Any country, any company that they think they can leverage and blackmail and sanction whatever they can, that's what they're left at. And you see it in the pages when they're talking about the pernicious Russian influence in Africa, and Russia is winning the information war outside of the West, right? You know, no one in Latin America listens to us. Why isn't India, standing against this? Why doesn't Brazil join the sanctions again and again? And they're frustrated that the rest of the world just refuses to take sides, and refuses, in the case of Africa, they're actually pro-Russian because they not because they have any great love for Russia, right? Russia is focused on national interests, right, and everything, but they see Russia resisting the US-led Western hegemony in a way that they are often powerless to do and have been for a long time, and it gives them hope. It is just a symbol of resistance, and that is enough. And that is why Russian flags are being flown in Mali and Burkina Faso and the Central African Republic, and why Borrell keeps lamenting, Lavrov is a rock star, and they don't listen to anything I say.
That's pretty damn funny. I read a really interesting article in the Unz Review. It was penned by Ron Unz himself, and he had a very provocative thesis that I want to float by you, because I mean, I think at this time, most commentators are looking at the conflict in Ukraine between NATO, the United States, and Russia. That is a war over Ukraine, right? And they're looking at it that the Americans are probably realizing that this is a losing cause, and they're pivoting to China, and they're already actively demonizing China. And, get ready for the big show, the war between the United States and China. And a lot of people are saying that the window of opportunity for the Americans to go to war with China is rapidly shrinking for various reasons. But everybody, a lot of commentators, and myself included, have been thinking, the war, the Sino-American War, that's what's coming up next. That's the next episode in this particular soap opera. But Ron Unz had a very provocative thesis. His notion was the following, that see, the United States over the last few years, starting at least in 2017, when the concept of the Thucydides trap was first articulated, there's been this notion that China is the emerging dominant power, and the current declining dominant power of the United States will go to war with China because it has historically happened countless times before. It didn't happen between the United States and Great Britain for geographic and historical reasons that aren't really important for this conversation. But the point is, Thucydides' trap would lead the declining power to provoke a war with the emerging power, and usually that spells the doom of the declining power. Yeah. But
for those of you who don't know, Thucydides was an ancient Greek political philosopher, and he talked about this in terms of the Greek city-states and Athenian hegemony. And Spartan hegemony, then the Peloponnesian hegemony. And he first theorized this, and it's a bête noire. It's a ridiculous thing that is propagated through geopolitical thinking, and the U.S. is fixated on it now because it's what they want to believe at this moment.
Yeah,
and they don't want to give.
I want to get to Un's thesis, which is really important, because to your point of the Africans joining the Russians or raising the Russian flag and so forth, and the rest of the world, the Indians, for instance, on basically on the Russians' side in this particular conflict, Saudi Arabia, Iran. Okay, Unz has the following notion that because of the over-aggressiveness of the Washington warmongers, Kagan and that whole cabal, right? That because of their over-aggressiveness, especially insofar as their sequestering of the Russian central bank assets, which spooked so many sovereign wealth funds, right? That everybody has gravitated to the Eurasian alliance, the Russia-China alliance, which is, they haven't signed a document of alliance, but they might as well have. And the rest of the world is gravitating towards them, which is lopsiding the conflict drastically. That the American influence and power has dramatically gone down, and the Eurasian alliance has dramatically gone up. And he is thinking that perhaps because of this, the window of opportunity to actually have a war between the United States and China has actually passed, because now it would be obvious that the Americans could not win either militarily. I mean, they've never won a war game, and economically and geopolitically. That's Un's thesis. I find it very intriguing. I mean, perhaps it's hopeful on my part, and clutching at straws that there won't be a Sino-American conflict, which could be catastrophic and go in all kinds of god-awful directions. What do you think of this thesis of Un's?
I want to believe, but I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a cynic and I'm a fatalist, and it's always done me well, right? I always.
Fair enough.
I always start off.
We'll go with what works.
Yeah. I always start off from the absolute worst assumption of everyone and everything, and allow myself to very slowly be walked back from that position by evidence and facts that I trust. That's the way I operate.
Okay.
I think that we have seen steps, right? You're talking Saudi Arabia. You're talking Turkey, you're talking India to a certain extent, right? Right. You could even talk about the UAE and Oman and
Brazil,
some other countries in there less important, right? But these are baby steps. And let's be clear. they're looking for options. They're not looking to join a revolution against US hegemony. They're looking for options, and these are baby steps in pursuit of their own defensive national interests. It is not yet that titanic sea change, that watershed, and it could lead to it, right? If the US keeps doing this, we will get there someday, and we'll get there sooner rather than later, but not in the time frame that we're talking here. I don't believe that at all. And another thing is, I don't believe that the West, particularly the US, is going to shift to China in a way that they give up on Ukraine. I don't believe that is ever going to happen. I think that they believe very much in a domino theory with Ukraine, that if they fail here, if Russia wins, or you have to remember that Russia has already won to a degree in Syria, right? Russia already won to a degree in Georgia in 2008, maybe even to a greater degree, right? But they cannot lose Ukraine after how much they have invested in it. I do not believe, right? I can certainly see a position where this big spring offensive, and I'm sure it's going to have surprises that we are not prepared for, and a lot of people out there listening to us are really going to start blackpilling sometime in the next couple of months. Because they're going to have successes, right? Russian forces are going to be forced in some areas to withdraw. They're going to have some surprise, dirty tricks that catch Russia off guard, right? The U.S. has been wargaming this for 9 months,
over a year, over a year,
right? I don't believe that ultimately it's going to be successful strategically, but everyone out there, be prepared that this is going to be a big battle, and Russia's going to suffer some losses, and they might have to withdraw in certain areas and so forth. But even after that is over, there's a belief that Washington and Brussels and London are just going to say, okay, we've had enough, we give up, and stop supporting the Kiev regime. That is not going to happen. First of all, there will be very strong arguments, very strong people, including the aforementioned Nuland and Borrell and Stoltenberg, that will push very, very hard for a coalition of the willing, meaning Poland, the US, the UK, the Baltics, possibly Romania, to send peacekeeping forces into West Ukraine, right? Yeah. That is, I talked about that already last July and August, and I still have seen nothing that convinces me that when they start to lose that badly, that they're not going to do that. Secondly, they can continue supporting a Kiev regime militarily and economically at a lower level that will still, and without, matching Russia per artillery shell and everything else, in a way that simply the Kiev regime going on the defensive and continuing to mass mobilize, forcibly conscript their population, they can continue to keep the costs of a Russian, occupation of all of Ukraine so high as to make it probably politically prohibitive to the Kremlin.
But you think
the Ukrainian forces
go ahead,
will be much better on defense, and always have been, will be much better on defense than these wasted offensives. They can lose this offensive and continue to fight for years with a decrease in Western support. And I don't want anyone to think that the only other solution there is the Kremlin signs some type of bullshit ceasefire or armistice or whatever. And that might even be temporary, right? I believe that Ukraine is going to be a zone of destabilization and insecurity for the rest of our lives. I don't believe in any long-term peace in Ukraine. I don't believe that those people in West Ukraine will ever accept the loss. I don't believe that the ideologists behind NATO and Atlanticism will ever accept the loss there. Not a total loss. I think this is, I said on this show and other shows, I said it the first week in March, that this is going to be a forever war, at least in the terms of our lifespans and everything. And nothing that is happening now has changed my opinion on that. It's actually only increased it. So try not to get too triumphalist in the.
I'm just trying to look at it as passionately as possible.
Yeah, but I think Russia is winning, but it's winning a long, nearly endless and bloody war of attrition and economic and warfare across the world. And I don't see an end to sight. What I'm saying is there's no happy endings here. There is no scenario for total victory in the way that some people may be thinking. I believe in a Russian victory, but that Russian victory ultimately will not be what I want and what a lot of other people want in the terms of it. And it may take a lot longer than people think.
Yeah, well, the Russians, the Russian leadership has avowedly prepared for a conflict that lasts 30 months. So we're talking into the late summer of 2025. No, excuse me, 2024, and that's at least. So that's what they're thinking and planning insofar as this conflict is concerned. I don't know. I think that there comes a limit to how much damage you can take before you finally collapse. And you've seen it in every kind of attrition war before this one. In the Civil War, the Confederates won the last 2 or 3 battles before they finally just collapsed and surrendered at Appomattox.
But the Confederates were a lot more reasonable people than the regime in Kiev is. I don't think that, first of all, if Zelensky actually signed any type of capitulation, they'd kill him and continue.
Oh yeah, on the spot. Yeah. My thinking is that Zelensky at some point, his nerve is going to break and he'll flee. That's my thinking. And Zelensky,
that's not the end of the war. That's not the end of the war. I mean, you've been to Lvov, you've been to Ivano-Frankovsk, right? I mean,
no, I haven't been to Ivano-Frankivsk, but I've been to Lvov. Yes.
Do you believe those people will ever give up?
There is a limit to how much damage you can take. I mean, everybody's got a breaking point. Everybody comes to that moment where, like, uncle, no matter how tough a fighter you are, there comes a moment when you're overwhelmed and you tap out. And
the Soviet Union had 50 years to get rid of Banderism in West Ukraine, and Stalin couldn't do it, and it didn't happen, and it resuscitated again like that.
My thinking about Western Ukraine is that the Russians, were they to occupy all of Ukraine, which I think is their ultimate goal, because they are not going to sign anything with the West. Were they to occupy all of Ukraine, I think that the first order of business would be to negotiate with the Poles to transfer Lviv and that whole shit show to the Poles. It would solve a lot of problems for the Russians, because all of a sudden they'd be able to just shove that all into Poland's lap, and it would also cause all kinds of chaos in Poland. In Poland and NATO and the European Union. Because all of a sudden other countries would be saying, hey, there's that territory over there. I want my dibs. How come the Poles get a big chunk and I don't? I'm oversimplifying, of course, but you get the point. And so I think that
meme has gone a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't believe that at all. I know that meme has been going around a lot around Russian Telegram, and it's popular. I think
I've been thinking this since April of last year.
Yeah.
So
I think it's Russian disinformation. I don't think the rest of NATO would ever allow Poland to do that, because it would completely
Destabilize.
rip apart their whole rationale for what's going on here. I believe there are people in Poland and people within the Polish government who might be like,
yeah,
can we do that? Yeah, right. But I don't think it will ever happen. I don't think they would ever be allowed to do that. I think that's a combination of wishful thinking and whatever Ukrainian rump state in whatever form, whether under U.S. Polish occupation or whatever, in West Ukraine will still be called Ukraine. It won't.
Yeah.
I don't believe it will be part, and it will be weaponized to the hilt, and they will breed a Banderite anti-Russian warrior caste that will exist for decades just to fight Russia, and that will not be an end to this conflict. They will fight guerrillas war. I just don't see how it ends. That didn't ever make me doubt that it needed to be done, right?
Mm-hmm.
My family's from Crimea and Donbass, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I know.
it should have been done 8-9 years ago. It would have been a lot easier, right? But I don't have any rose-colored glasses about how it ends. In fact, my glasses are, if they're not black pill, they're pretty gray. They're pretty gray. Dark shade of gray. 50 different shades of gray here.
Yeah, I'll lay my cards on the table and no problem. My thinking is that this offensive, which I do believe that Washington is pushing it desperately, that they are pulling out all the stops to push this offensive, no matter how
there was a
suicidal it might be.
Newsweek headline about the offensive being done to appease NATO. That was a Newsweek headline, to appease NATO.
Jesus Christ, man. So my thinking is that I consider it a suicidal attack. Perhaps there are some surprises along the way, but I don't see any of these surprises. Even the use of dirty bombs, I don't see any of these surprises really making a hell of a lot of difference in the final outcome, which would be that the Kiev regime would ultimately commit suicide of its own army and be left naked. And that the Russians will roll in and take it over and start carving up what remains of Ukraine. They'll create a rump state east of the Dnieper, take over everything. West of the Dnieper, take over everything east of the Dnieper, including Odessa and Transnistria, and eventually and carve off a piece of Western Ukraine, because I completely agree with you that there would be enormous guerrilla warfare in this occupied Ukraine rump state, and that I think that the Russian calculation would be to just slice it all off, cut off the gangrene, if you will, dump all these crazies into Lvov and areas adjacent, and let it be the Poles' problem, and leave a rump Ukraine state with Kiev, with West Kiev as the capital, and which is the historical site, historical side of Kiev, and install a puppet regime. I mean, they've got Yanukovych and they've got Medvedchuk calmly waiting there in Moscow. Why do you think that they have them there? I think that is sort of like the ultimate end to this conflict, and I think that you have said so, that Putin is an extremely cautious and incrementalist kind of guy, and he's a guy who likes to have things settled and not have endless conflict. He pacified Chechnya, and he got to a basic settlement insofar as Georgia. I think that that's basically in the cards. How long this will take, I don't know. But I think that is the ultimate direction of travel. And do keep in mind, officially on Wikipedia, the population of Ukraine was supposed to be 45 million. But at this time, the area of Ukraine that is not occupied by Russians, what it currently stands as Kiev-controlled Ukraine, has a population of not more than 22 million.
22, 25. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
And so that once they take over cities like Kharkov, Sumy, and everything, east of the Dnieper, it'll be even smaller. We're going to be talking about a country of maybe 15 million people. It'll be very easy to pacify that country, no matter how large it might happen to be. And also, there's something else too that other commentators have mentioned. See, guerrilla warfare tend to happen and are effective when there are close interconnected family relationships and kinship relationships, like in Vietnam, like in Afghanistan. But that kind of relationship is not so tight in Ukraine, especially among the urban populations, and that they would consider it easier to flee as opposed to stick around and carry out guerrilla warfare. So it would be even smaller population that would need to be controlled by the Russians. So that's my thinking at this time. I mean, events will play out, and I could be completely wrong. It could be, Kiev tomorrow comes up with some wonder weapon, and they wipe out the Russians and they reconquer Crimea. Who knows? But my point, at this time, with the pieces on the board, this is where I think it's going. But you virulently disagree. No, it's fine.
No. I simply think so. I agree that whatever happens in the next 2 months, whatever tricks they pull, ultimately strategically, it will fail. Right? Yeah. Whatever. Again, I think that they will have success at points, and there will be surprises. I don't believe in wonder weapons, but I worry about what NATO does after that.
Yeah,
and I don't believe that the Kiev regime gives up or rolls over. And I think that a Kiev regime with even less Western support can continue to resist for a very long time. There was a belief in the Kremlin that economically, politically, the Maidan regime would collapse of its own accord. From 2014 to 2015, that was the great hope. Oh, we don't need to do anything; they'll just collapse of their own accord.
That was kind of thinking.
I'm kind of think that this is the same kind of thing. I think that they can and will continue to resist. They will never stop getting, even if it's a decreased level of Western support. I think one thing, I think that the U.S., the West can continue this conflict, even if at a lower level, indefinitely, and still get involved in the great, Sino-American War in the West Pacific, because so many of the resources that they would need for a naval and air war there's very little overlap for what they need to support Ukraine here. One of them is ATACMS. You notice they won't give Kiev ATACMS. Why? Because they need ATACMS for China. Not because Kiev couldn't use them, right? And it's not out of fear out of Russian escalation or retaliation. It's because they're already planning that the next war starts while this one at some level continues. Because the war resources, artillery shells aren't any good, right? HIMARS, very limited usage, right? So on and so on. So I think that they're preparing for that eventuality, that at some level this conflict continues in, more or less indefinitely. I maybe ceasefire for 6 months, maybe an armistice for a year, but I don't see this ever being settled. I think the only question is where the informal partition of Ukraine takes place.
Yeah, and by the way, you don't have any belief in any kind of like Korea solution of having a DMZ of some sort, and they call a halt to it at that point.
Well, the logical point for that would be the Dnieper. That would be the logical point for the Dnieper, and I would still consider that a Russian victory, with the the realization that the rest of Ukraine will still be turned into a battle platform against Russia going forward, right? That will be that will not be an ultimate end to it, right? Until the U.S. collapses, which is I still think is longer. We would all like it to be tomorrow, but it's they're still going to be first among equals for, well, of course, the the Sino-American War could drastically change things in a
Oh,
way even greater than this war. So that could be a black swan. But I just don't see an end to this conflict. I think it could be frozen.
yeah.
You could have an armistice type situation. But I know that ultimately I will not have as much of I don't consider it just a Russian victory. I consider it an East Ukrainian victory.
Mhm.
You will never get me to call that government, that regime, Ukraine. I've never said there are Ukrainians on both sides of this war. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainians fighting against this regime. They've been fighting against it longer than Russia has. The regime there has arrested and disappeared thousands of collaborators across the country. They're pogroming the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, right? There was nothing wrong with the idea of an independent Ukraine until they flew the yellow and blue flag along the red and black, and they claimed the mantle of Ukrainian national identity as being synonymous and tried to force that on the whole of the country.
Yeah. A final question before we wrap it up. I wanted to ask you about the current sentiment in Russia insofar as the assassination of this blogger who's named always, I'm terrible with names. And so his name's Tatarsky. Thank you so much. Yeah. What's the mood in Russia and also in Bryansk? Was it that random terrorist attack that just seemed just evil? Just shooting up civilians for no purpose whatsoever. What has been the reaction in Russia at this time? I mean, you for people who don't know, Mark teaches at Moscow State University. Moscow State, right?
Yeah, I have taught at Moscow. I'm not teaching there this semester.
Oh, okay. But
I'm focused on the media thing right now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've taught at Moscow State. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is your sense at this time of in Russian people's perception of this war? Because I've been getting contradictory information about it from different people.
Yeah.
Some say that they're all focused on it. Others say they're almost indifferent to it and la-di-da, like it's happening far away. What's your perception?
I would say that that's true of a significant number of Russians, that they are as engaged with this war as Americans and Brits were with the Iraq war. That said, very little. Yeah, it doesn't really affect them. It's something that's going on. They try to ignore it. Maybe they moderately support it. The majority, maybe some of them moderately oppose it, but it's not enough for them to really, protest or do anything about. But that said, there is a higher percentage of Russians who are very actively engaged in it, right? And Tatarsky had a very large following that transcended out of the Telegram, and Telegram's really big in Russia and in Ukraine, by the way. Was already into the realm of mainstream Russian media. So there is a significant portion of the Russian population that is outraged and furious and so forth. But there is a larger percentage of the Russian population that had no idea who he was and isn't affected. And most of them will hear about it on the news and say, that's terrible. Those people over there are awful. Why don't we finish this thing already? But I don't want to overstate the amount of Russians that are actively engaged with this. I do think it's higher, again, than the number of Americans that were engaged in anything like Iraq and everything like that. But there is a portion of the Russian population, and it's not insignificant, that is very disengaged disengaged from this completely.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
particularly in Moscow, which is the most liberal city in Russia by far.
Yeah. So we've been going on for an hour and a half, and I think I'm going to wind it down because I don't want to. I know Mark he has other media appearances. He's actually doing me a big favor for having come on. Mark, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And Chad, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. And by the way, before I go, I just want to thank Zariel, JJ, Reckless Abandon. I saw Pamela around moderating. They're all the moderators. And also, Chris is not here. I want to thank all of my moderators for having been on. And Susie Q is here. Hey, Susie. Well, I adore all of my moderators. They're wonderful people. And I want to thank you all for having moderated.
Someone in the comments just asked, Putin's approval rating, yes, is still high 70s, low 80s.
Yeah. Final plug, Mark's Twitter is below. And Mark, you put on Twitter anything that people can go and check out other than your Twitter feed, right?
Yeah, at Mark Sleboda 1, my YouTube channel, The Real Politic with Mark Sleboda, and my Telegram channel. Oh, and my Substack as well.
Yeah. And JJ, yes, I mentioned Zariel. And yeah, and by the way, chat, do me a favor. You know, like my Twitter has been like all of a sudden they're throttling it. I was getting like you know, actually a few hundred new followers every day, and all of a sudden it just shrunk radically. Something happened at Twitter. So please follow me on Twitter, where I post regularly, and follow Mark, of course. And yeah, and to my Patreon supporters, thanks very much. And I will talk to you on Sunday for my live broadcast to my Patreon supporters. And that's it. So thank you so much, Mark. Stick around for a few final words. Chat, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Show Mark out with a bunch of +1s. I'd really appreciate it. And yeah, that's it. Take it easy, guys.